She saved her brother's life, but the world only saw her scar. For years she hid behind it, believing she was broken. But when a millionaire steps into her life, everything changes. Will she finally let herself be seen for who she truly is? The world may have its judgments, but her story's about to take a turn you never saw coming. Stay with us till the end to find out how she finds the strength to rise again. Sarah had long since learned to navigate the busy streets of San Francisco with a practiced indifference, her movements almost automatic. Every day she stepped into the cafe, where the clang of dishes and the murmur of voices formed a steady background hum. She became part of the rhythm. To most, she was nothing more than a waitress, a fixture in the cafe's bustling routine. But beneath her calm exterior, a storm raged, a storm she had become skilled at hiding. It wasn't that Sarah didn't enjoy the work. She did. The familiarity of the cafe, the steady rush of customers, the comfort of knowing what to expect, it had all become part of her world. But she often felt like an outsider in her own life, as though she were playing a role instead of living it. Her scar, the thin, jagged line that ran from her temple to just above her cheekbone, reminded her of that every day. It was the one thing that defined her, that made her different, even in a city like San Francisco, where diversity was supposed to be celebrated. The scar had been a part of her for as long as she could remember, but it hadn't always been there. It was the result of a tragedy, a moment that defined not only her childhood but also the person she became. At just 12 years old, she had been faced with a choice. Her family's car had skidded off the road on a rainy afternoon, crashing into a guardrail. The glass shattered, the flames began to rise, and in that moment, Sarah had acted. She had reached through the smoke and broken glass to pull her younger brother from the wreckage, taking the brunt of the impact herself. The scar was a mark of her survival, of her courage in the face of unimaginable fear. But the world didn't see it that way. To the world, it was simply a flaw. It wasn't that Sarah was ashamed of what had happened. She wasn't. But she had learned long ago that the world didn't care about the story behind the scar. All they saw was the imperfection. The scar became a symbol, not of survival, but of something broken, something to be pitied or avoided. And so Sarah had learned to live with it, to keep her head down, to avoid the gaze of others. She had become an expert at blending in, at staying in the background. But blending in didn't always work. There were days when the weight of the world's gaze became too much. The whispers, the stares, the cruel jokes that never seemed to stop. They all cut deeper than she cared to admit. She had built walls around herself, but the pain still found its way through the cracks. She had learned to put on a mask, a smile that never quite reached her eyes. The cafe became her refuge, the one place where she could retreat behind the counter and serve coffee to people who didn't have the time to look too closely. Most of the time it worked. Most of the time she could escape the harsh reality of what people saw when they looked at her face. But there were moments. Moments when the world's judgment pressed too hard, when the whispers became too loud, when the weight of her scar felt unbearable. It was one of those moments when Sarah first noticed him, Ethan. He had been coming to the cafe for a few weeks now, always sitting in the same booth by the window. He was different from the usual crowd, more subdued, quieter. He never hurried through his meal, never seemed impatient like the others. His eyes, dark but kind, always seemed to meet hers with a level of understanding that unsettled her. It wasn't pity. She had come to expect pity, but with him it was something else. It was as if he saw her, not as a waitress, not as someone to be judged, but as a person. At first, Sarah had tried to avoid him. She wasn't sure why, but something about him made her uncomfortable. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, like he could see right through the walls she had so carefully constructed. Or maybe it was because, for the first time in a long time, someone was seeing her for who she truly was. She couldn't let that happen. Not again. But Ethan didn't go away. Week after week, he returned to his corner booth, ordering the same thing: black coffee and a slice of apple pie. He didn't ask for anything more. Didn't make her feel like she had to be anything other than herself. There was no awkwardness when their eyes met. He never looked away. And slowly over time, Sarah began to let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't like the others. It was a Thursday when he first spoke to her. It wasn't anything extraordinary, just a simple thank you when she brought him his coffee. But there was something in his voice, something soft and genuine, that caught her off guard. She had become used to the gruff thanks from the regulars. the impersonal exchanges with customers who barely noticed her beyond their orders. But with Ethan it was different. He had noticed her, had seen her, and for reasons Sarah couldn't explain, it made her heart race in a way she wasn't prepared for. The following week, Ethan spoke again. He complimented her on how she handled the rude group of professionals who had made cruel jokes about her scar the week before. His words were simple, but they meant more than Sarah could express. "You handled that with more grace than most people," he said, his voice calm but earnest. Most people would have walked out or thrown a pot of coffee in their faces. Sarah had been taken aback by his comment, her breath catching in her throat. Grace? She had never thought of herself as graceful. Not with the scar. Not with the way people looked at her. But Ethan seemed to see something she didn't. His words weren't pitying. They weren't designed to make her feel small. They were a recognition of something Sarah had never acknowledged in herself. For the first time in years, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as broken as she had always believed. That perhaps there was more to her than just a scar. But that hope was fleeting. It couldn't last. Sarah had built her life on walls, on the belief that people would never see her as anything more than a scarred face. Ethan might see her differently, but what did that matter? In the end, the world would always see the scar first. She would always be the girl with the mark of something tragic, someone to be pitied, someone not quite whole. And yet, as she served him week after week, something inside her began to shift. Ethan's steady presence, his quiet respect, slowly started to chip away at the walls she had built around herself. It was a slow process, one Sarah wasn't sure she was ready for. But every time their eyes met, every time he smiled at her, without a hint of judgment, it felt like a small victory. For the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than hiding behind the mask she had worn for so long. Maybe there was a chance for something more, something beyond the scar. But as Sarah stood behind the counter, serving coffee to a world that barely saw her, she knew it wouldn't be easy. She knew the judgment would never stop. And yet, for the first time, she wondered if it was time to let herself be seen. Perhaps Ethan was the first person to see her for who she truly was. Not the scarred girl, but Sarah. And maybe that was enough. Ethan's arrival at the cafe didn't feel like anything extraordinary at first. For weeks, he had simply been another face in the crowd, a quiet observer in the background. He came in with an air of calm that stood in stark contrast to the rush of the daily cafe routine. He didn't come during the peak hours when the din of loud chatter and hurried orders overwhelmed the senses. Instead, he came during the quiet lulls, the moments between the rushes when the cafe had a softer, almost intimate feel. He sat in the same corner booth near the window, where the light filtered in just enough to cast a warm glow over his table. He never ordered anything complicated, just black coffee and a slice of apple pie. It was a ritual, something steady, in the midst of her otherwise chaotic world. At first, Sarah noticed him because of the stillness he carried with him, how he never seemed hurried, never seemed bothered by the usual chaos of the cafe. Most customers, especially during the morning rush, were impatient. They fidgeted in their seats, checking their watches, tapping their fingers on the table. But not Ethan. He sat with a quiet presence, almost meditative. And in a way, that steadiness unsettled Sarah. She had become so accustomed to people skimming over her, to being ignored and overlooked, that anyone who took the time to look at her, even for a second, felt intrusive. Ethan didn't seem to mind the busy noise of the cafe. He sat through it all, never hurrying, never demanding, just content in his own space. And yet every time Sarah passed by, his gaze would catch hers, steady and unflinching. It was the way he looked at her that unsettled her the most. Most people, she thought, saw only the scar. It was the first thing they noticed, the first thing they judged. She had learned long ago to hide behind her apron, to keep her face turned slightly away from the world. But Ethan didn't look at her with the usual discomfort. He didn't flinch when his eyes met hers. He didn't look away quickly, as if ashamed by what he saw. At first, Sarah couldn't decide if she wanted to avoid him or acknowledge him. She found herself watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, studying the way he always took, his time with his coffee, the way he savored the pie without rushing through it. Something about him seemed too constant, too present. It was as though he was a reminder of everything she had tried to bury. It wasn't long before he spoke, to her. The conversation was casual, but there was an earnestness in his tone that Sarah couldn't shake. "Thank you," he had said, his voice low but clear. "I appreciate the way you handle everything here. It's not easy, but you do it with a kind of grace." Sarah froze for a moment. Grace? It was a word she had never associated with herself, certainly. Not with the girl who had lived with a scar for so many years. To her, grace was something delicate, something beautiful. It was a word reserved for people who had been untouched by the world's harshness, not someone who had been branded by it. Grace, she had repeated softly, more to herself than to him. She wasn't sure what to say. She hadn't expected such a comment. Ethan smiled, a small understanding smile that made something shift in her chest. "Yes," he said simply. "You don't just go through the motions. You carry yourself with something more." It wasn't pity in his words. He wasn't looking at her like she was someone to be saved, someone broken who needed fixing. There was no judgment in his tone, only acknowledgement. Ethan seemed to see something in her that she had long stopped seeing in herself. It wasn't just the waitress with a scar. It was Sarah, a person who had learned to endure, to keep going despite the cruel and often demeaning stares of the world. Sarah didn't know how to respond. She wasn't used to being seen for anything other than her imperfections. She had spent years hiding behind the apron, behind the counter, keeping herself just out of reach of people's judgment. But with Ethan it felt different. It felt like he wasn't just tolerating her presence, but actually noticing her, seeing her. And yet the thought of letting someone in felt like a dangerous risk. She had built walls around herself, brick by brick over the years, to protect herself from the hurt. Every mocking glance, every cruel comment had only reinforced the need to stay hidden. She had learned the hard way that the world didn't see her for who she was. They saw only the scar. But as the days went by, Ethan continued to come, and their exchanges became more frequent. At first, they were small, casual comments about the weather, the coffee, or the pie. But soon, their conversations grew deeper. She found herself telling him things she hadn't told anyone in years. She shared stories of her childhood, of her little brother Ben, of the summers spent running barefoot through fields before everything changed. Ethan listened without interruption, without the urge to offer advice or pity. He simply listened, his eyes calm and thoughtful, as if her words mattered, as if she mattered. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult morning shift, Sarah found herself sitting down at the counter, exhausted. She was wiping down a table when Ethan arrived. He greeted her as usual, but today there was a new look. In his eyes, a softness that made Sarah pause. She tried to shake off the feeling of vulnerability, but she couldn't. "I've been thinking about something you said the other day," Ethan said, his voice gentle. "About how you handle things here. I've been thinking about it a lot, actually. It's not just about the work. It's about the way you carry yourself. It's rare to see someone like you, someone who has been through so much and still shows up every day without letting the world break them." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. No one had ever said anything like that to her. No one had ever acknowledged the weight she carried with such kindness, such sincerity. It wasn't just about the scar. It was about her. All of her. Her strength, her resilience, her ability to keep going despite everything. She swallowed hard, struggling to keep the emotion in check. "You don't know me," she said, though the words felt empty even as she said them. "You don't know what it's been." Like, Ethan's gaze never wavered. "Maybe not," he said, "but I know that you've been through something that most people can't even begin to imagine. And I see that in the way you carry yourself. You're not broken, Sarah. You're stronger than most people will ever understand." Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that she wasn't broken, that the scars, both the visible and invisible, didn't define her. But the world had always taught her otherwise. The world had always told her that the scar was something to be ashamed of, something to hide, something that made her less than everyone else. But Ethan was looking at her with those steady, kind eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to wonder if he was right. Maybe she wasn't broken. Maybe she had always been stronger than she thought. The thought was terrifying, but it was also freeing. It was the first time. She had allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was more to her than the scar. That maybe she was more than just the sum of her past and the judgments of others. And for the first time, Sarah realized that the world didn't need to define her. She could define herself. But as much as she wanted to believe Ethan, there was a part of her, an old familiar voice, that told her to be cautious, to pull back, to keep her distance. It was the same voice that had kept her hidden for so long. The voice that reminded her that people like Ethan, people who saw her as more than her imperfections, were few and far between. And maybe, just maybe, it was better not to get too close. Because in the end, the world would always see her for the scar and not the person beneath it. Still, as she stood there meeting Ethan's gaze, a small part of her wondered if she could let go of the fear, if she could take the risk and allow herself to be seen. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. Maybe it was time to let someone in. The days began to blur together as Sarah fell into a quiet routine. She woke early, slipped into her uniform, and went through the motions of each day at the cafe. But something had changed. She didn't quite understand it yet. But Ethan's presence had subtly shifted the landscape of her life. He wasn't just another customer. He had become a fixture, not just in the cafe but in her thoughts. And for the first time in years, she found herself hoping for more than the silence she had buried herself in. At first, Sarah had kept her distance. She hadn't trusted her own feelings, let alone someone else's. There was a quiet war inside her, a battle between wanting to retreat into the comfort of solitude and longing to reach out, to let someone in. Ethan didn't make it easy to hide. There was something about him that drew her in, something steady and unassuming yet unwavering. He came every week at the same time, and he always sat in the same booth by the window. It was as though he knew the rhythms of the cafe just as well as she did, and somehow over time their silences grew more comfortable. He wasn't intrusive. He didn't force her to open up. But every time their eyes met, Sarah could feel the unspoken understanding between them. She had learned to guard herself, to keep her emotions tucked away behind the careful mask she wore each day. It wasn't a matter of hiding who she was. It was a matter of survival. The world had taught her early on that vulnerability was a weakness, that the scars, both seen and unseen, made her something less than others. Ethan, though, didn't seem to view her that way. He didn't see her scar as a flaw. He didn't see her as broken. He saw her as Sarah. And that was a revelation that took time for her to truly accept. The conversations between them began to shift from small talk to something deeper, something more meaningful. It wasn't immediate, but over time the walls Sarah had built around herself began to crumble, one conversation at a time. He asked her about her life, about her childhood, about the things that made her happy. And though Sarah was hesitant at first, she found herself sharing things she hadn't spoken of in years. One afternoon, as they sat in the cafe after the lunch rush, Ethan asked her about the scar. His voice was gentle, not probing, but he had a curiosity about him that made Sarah feel like he truly wanted to know her story, not just the surface. Details. "I've been thinking about something," he said, looking at her with that same steady gaze that always seemed to strip away her defenses. "You've never talked about how it happened. About the scar, I mean. If you ever feel like telling me, I'd love to listen." Sarah froze for a moment. The words he spoke seemed simple, but they carried a weight that she wasn't sure she was ready for. The scar had always been her story to tell, or to hide, and she had spent so many years keeping it locked away, buried under layers of denial and distraction. But with Ethan, something inside her stirred. She wasn't sure why she wanted to tell him. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, with no trace of pity, just curiosity and understanding. Or maybe it was the way his presence made her feel like she didn't have to hide anymore. "I was 12, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was a car accident. My family and I were coming home from a camping trip. The roads were slick from rain. My dad lost control of the car and we went off the road, hit a ditch and flipped over. I didn't think. I just climbed over the broken glass and pulled my little brother out. The glass cut me across my face. I didn't feel it at first. I just wanted to get him out of there." Her voice faltered as she spoke, the memories flooding back with vivid clarity. She had never allowed herself to truly reflect on that moment, to let herself feel the weight of it. But as she looked at Ethan, she realized she had never shared it with anyone. Not like this, not with someone who wasn't looking at her with pity. She wasn't sure why she was telling him now, but it felt like the right thing to do. For once, it felt like the scar wasn't something to hide, but something to share. Ethan didn't speak at first. He just listened, allowing her the space to continue, his expression unreadable but patient. "After that, everything changed," Sarah continued, her voice thick with emotion. "People didn't look at me the same way. At school, they looked at me like I was a freak. The other kids would stare at me, whisper behind my back. One of my teachers even suggested I sit at the back of the classroom so I'd be more comfortable. I left school halfway through my sophomore year. It was just easier that way. Ethan's eyes softened as she spoke, but he didn't offer any immediate response. He simply nodded, as if he were processing what she had said. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he finally said, his voice low and sincere. "It sounds like you had to carry more than anyone should at such a young age, but I don't think people understand. Not really. They don't see the bravery it took to do what you did, to pull him out, to survive. All they see is the scar." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't expected him to say that. In a world where people had always treated her like she was somehow less because of the scar, Ethan's words felt like a weight had been lifted. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't broken after all. "Most people don't see it that way," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They see it as a flaw. Something to be fixed. Something ugly." Ethan shook his head slowly. "I don't see it as ugly. I see it as a story. A story of survival. Of strength. You're not a victim, Sarah. You're someone who fought through something unimaginable and lived to tell the tale." Her heart fluttered at his words. She had never thought of it that way. For so long she had defined herself by the scar, the mark of something tragic. But in that moment she began to see it differently. Ethan saw her strength, not just the pain. He didn't pity her. He admired her. And that realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. As the weeks went on, their conversations continued to deepen. They began to talk about more than just her past. They spoke about their hopes, their dreams, their fears. Ethan shared his own stories, his own vulnerabilities. He wasn't perfect, Sarah realized. He had his own struggles, his own challenges. And yet he was here in this small cafe with her, not because he wanted to fix her, but because he simply enjoyed her company. With each passing day, Sarah felt herself opening up more. She found herself looking forward to his visits, to the quiet moments they shared. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that she could be seen, truly seen, not as a scarred woman, but as Sarah, a woman with strength, with courage, and with a future worth fighting for. But even as she began to let Ethan in, there was a part of her that hesitated, a part of her that feared the inevitable. What if he left? What if the world's judgment, the same judgment that had followed her for years, found its way into their world? She wasn't sure she could face that. She wasn't sure she could let someone in only to have them look at her the way everyone else did, through the lens of her scars. And yet every time she saw Ethan's steady gaze, heard his calm voice, she began to wonder if she could finally allow herself to believe that she was more than the sum of her past, more than the scars she had hidden for so long. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop hiding. It was time to let someone in. The rhythm of Sarah's life had settled into a quiet comfort, one she never anticipated after years of feeling out of place, overshadowed by her past and the world's gaze. She had begun to let down her guard, to share more of herself with Ethan. There was something about him, something steady and constant, that made her feel seen in a way she had longed for but never dared to believe was possible. They were building something, a connection, a friendship, and perhaps more than that. For once, she felt the weight of the world's judgment begin to lift, but as the days passed, Sarah's fragile peace began to crack. It happened one afternoon when the weather was grey and the cafe was quieter than usual. The usual hum of clinking, dishes and muted chatter felt far away as Sarah wiped down a table, her mind lost in a brief moment of reflection on how her life had been changing. She had become someone who could look in the mirror without cringing, someone who could walk into the cafe without immediately tensing at the thought of being judged. She had begun to hope that there might be more for her, beyond the scar, beyond the hurt. Her phone buzzed as she cleaned, a notification blinking on the screen. At first, she didn't think much of it, another customer review or perhaps a text from her mom. But when she picked it up, her heart sank. The headline flashed across the screen. "Billionaire in hiding spotted dining with scarred waitress, what's really going on?" The rest of the article blurred as she scanned the photo that accompanied it. There, in grainy detail, was a picture of her and Ethan, sitting together in their usual booth. The light from the window caught her face just enough to reveal the scar in all its sharpness, the lines still noticeable despite time's effort to soften them. Ethan was beside her, smiling, Just the two of them, seemingly enjoying a quiet moment. For a moment, everything stopped. Sarah's hands trembled, and the room around her seemed to fade away. Her stomach churned as her eyes flicked over the article. The words blurred and sharpened in quick succession. Billionaire in hiding, the scarred waitress, public scandal. Her breath caught in her throat. She had seen this kind of thing happen before, to other people, but never to her, never like this. The world had just torn her life open, and she felt exposed. The cruel undercurrent of online comments surged. People who didn't know her, people who had never looked beyond her scar, offering their judgments. Words like charity case and PR stunt flashed across the screen. The most cutting of all read, "Guess even billionaires have a thing for damaged goods." Sarah's eyes burned. The weight of every cruel word, every mocking glance she had ever endured, crushed down on her with suffocating force. She didn't know if she was trembling from anger or from fear. It didn't matter. The damage was done. She wasn't the girl who could hide anymore. Her face, her scar was out there for the world to see. And Ethan, who had been nothing but kind and patient, had become the subject of ridicule as well. The scandal wasn't just about her anymore. It was about them both. It wasn't long before the phone calls started. Her mother's voice, filled with concern, asking questions Sarah didn't have answers for. Her friends suddenly all reaching out, questioning if it was true. The barrage of questions, the judgment, the whispers. It was all too much. She could feel the walls closing in, suffocating her. The once comfortable life she had started to build felt like it was unraveling in an instant. She didn't respond to her mother. She didn't take any of the calls. Instead, she went into autopilot mode, finishing her shift in silence, trying to pretend like nothing was happening, like nothing had changed. She moved mechanically, clearing plates, refilling drinks, keeping her face steady. But inside, everything was breaking apart. By the time she reached home, her phone was practically vibrating with the constant notifications. Text messages, emails, social media tags. It was all too much. She turned the phone off and tossed it onto the couch, but the silence that followed felt like a vacuum. The world was too close now. She couldn't breathe. She was suffocating in the aftermath of a photo, a moment, a story that wasn't hers to tell. The worst part wasn't the cruel comments or the questions from people who didn't understand. It wasn't the feeling of being exposed. It was the weight of knowing that she had dragged Ethan into this, into a story he hadn't asked for, into a world that didn't see him for who he was, only for what the headlines could make him. He had shown her kindness, had looked at her with respect when no one else had. And now he was caught in the storm with her. She couldn't let him be a part of this. She couldn't let him see her like this, broken, scared, completely exposed. So she did what she always did when the world felt too heavy. She pushed him away. She retreated into herself, away from the one person who had made her feel seen, who had made her feel human again. She didn't respond to any of Ethan's messages. She didn't answer the door when he knocked. Every time she saw his name on her phone, her chest tightened. She couldn't bring herself to face him, not like this. Not when the whole world had decided to make her a spectacle. Days passed and Sarah shut herself off from everything. She ignored the messages, the calls, the reminders that the world was still watching. She stayed in her apartment, hiding from the noise, from the public eye, from the reality of what had happened. She didn't know how to face Ethan. She didn't know how to face anyone. But Ethan didn't stop. He didn't give up. Every day, like clockwork, he sent a message. Sometimes short, "I'm here if you need me." Other times longer, "I understand if you need space, but I want you to know I'm not going anywhere." His words were always kind, always patient, but they made her feel even more guilty. He didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve to be dragged into her mess, to be part of the narrative the world had spun about her. One evening, after a particularly long stretch of silence between them, Sarah heard a knock on her door. Her heart raced in her chest as she hesitated, wondering if she could ignore it. But the knock came again, louder this time, followed by a voice she knew all too well. "Sarah," Ethan called gently through the door. "I know you're in there. Please, can we talk?" Her hands shook as she stood there frozen. Every instinct in her screamed to stay behind the door, to remain in the safety of her own isolation. But a small voice in her head urged her to open it, to face him, to finally confront the mess she had made. She opened the door slowly, her heart pounding. Ethan stood there, his hands in his pockets, his expression serious but not angry. He didn't look at her with disappointment, didn't say anything about the scandal or the comments. He just stood there waiting. "I didn't want this for you," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "I didn't want to drag you into my mess." Ethan shook his head, stepping forward. "This isn't a mess, Sarah. It's just life. And I'm not going anywhere." She blinked, tears threatening to spill. "But the world sees me as a joke. A scarred waitress, someone to pity, someone to mock. I'm not what you think I am." Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch warm and steady. "I see you for who you are, Sarah. Not the scar, not the stories others tell about you. I see the person you fought to become, the person I've gotten to know over the past few weeks. You're not a joke. You're not broken. And you don't have to face this alone." For the first time in days, Sarah allowed herself to breathe. She allowed herself to believe in the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was still something worth fighting for, something beyond the noise and judgment of the world. "I'm sorry," she whispered, looking at him. "I didn't mean to push you away. I was scared." "I know," he said softly, his voice unwavering, "but I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." The days after Ethan had knocked on her door felt like an awakening. Sarah wasn't sure how to describe the shift, but something inside her had changed. She had spent so long hiding behind walls, behind her scar, behind her fear of being seen, for who she truly was, that the idea of letting someone in, especially someone like Ethan, had felt impossible. But when he had stood there, so patient and unwavering, it was as if he had offered her a lifeline. Sarah didn't know exactly what she was holding on to anymore. The weight of the scandal, the judgment of the world, the whispers and the stares, all of it was still there. The world outside hadn't stopped. But there was something about the steady presence of Ethan, his refusal to be shaken by the storm, that made her feel like maybe she didn't have to carry all of this by herself. Over the next few weeks, Sarah slowly began to let go of the walls she had built so carefully around her heart. She started opening herself up to Ethan in ways she hadn't done with anyone before. The floodgates, once locked tight, began to creak open. It wasn't easy. She had spent years hiding from the world, burying parts of herself that she feared would make her unworthy. But with Ethan, something felt different. He didn't want to fix her. He didn't need her to be perfect. He simply wanted to be there, by her side, steady and calm. Their conversations grew deeper, more real. Sarah shared her fears, the insecurities that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long. Ethan listened without judgment, without a hint of pity. He didn't try to make her feel better with empty reassurances. Instead, he allowed her the space to feel everything, the pain, the fear, the anger, and he stood beside her while she sorted through it all. There were moments when Sarah felt like she was drowning in the weight of everything. The fallout from the scandal, the noise of the world outside, the lingering sting of past hurts. But there were also moments when Ethan's presence was enough to keep her grounded. His quiet strength, his gentle words, his unwavering belief in her. It was more than she had ever expected, more than she had ever thought she deserved. As Sarah allowed herself to lean into Ethan's support, she began to realize something profound. She wasn't broken. She had been through unimaginable pain, yes, but she had survived. And that survival, the resilience it had taken to get through it, was not something to be ashamed of. It was something to be proud of. The scar on her face was a mark of that. Survival. A reminder that she had faced death, had faced fear, and had come out stronger on the other side. Ethan's words about strength began to echo in her mind, like a refrain that slowly became a part of her own narrative. Strength was not about being perfect or flawless. It wasn't about hiding the parts of herself that she had once seen as weak. Strength was about accepting herself, all of herself, scars and all, and choosing to keep going despite the world's judgment. And so slowly, Sarah began to do just that. She began to paint again. It was a quiet act, one that had always been a source of solace for her, but had been abandoned in the wake of her accident. She had convinced herself for years that it didn't matter, that no one would care about the paintings of a scarred girl. But as she picked up the paintbrush again, as she let her hands move across the canvas, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. Her first few paintings were tentative, unsure, as though she were still finding her way back to the part of herself she had hidden away. But each stroke of the brush felt like a step toward healing. With each piece, she allowed herself to express something she had kept buried inside, a story of pain, of survival, of strength. And with each painting, she felt the scar on her face, once a symbol of shame, transform into something else, a part of her story, a part of her strength. One evening, as Sarah was finishing a painting, her younger brother Ben came over to visit. He had been away at college, and though they spoke often, she hadn't seen him in person for a while. When he walked into her apartment, she stood up to greet him, and for the first time she saw him look at her, not with the soft gaze of a protective sibling, but with a new understanding. "You're painting again," he said, his voice low but full of something Sarah couldn't quite place. "I am," she replied softly, her hands still stained with paint. "It's been a while." Ben looked at the canvas in front of her, his expression unreadable. But then, after a long pause, he stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You know, you were the first person I ever trusted," he said quietly. Sarah blinked, surprised by the sudden weight of his words. "What do you mean?" Ben looked down, his eyes filled with an emotion Sarah couldn't name. "When the car flipped, when everything went to hell, I didn't think anyone would get me out of there. But then I saw you. You didn't think about yourself. You just crawled through the broken glass and you pulled me out. I knew then I could always trust you. You were the bravest person I've ever known." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She didn't need to. Ben's words, the quiet weight of them, filled the empty spaces inside her. She had never realized how much that moment had shaped not just her own survival, but her brother's perception of her. She had always seen herself as the one who had been left behind, the one who had been damaged. But Ben saw her as the person who had saved him. To him, she was not broken. She was everything. As Ben left that evening, Sarah stood in front of her, easel, her heart full. She no longer saw the scar as a mark of something tragic. It was a reminder of her courage, of her ability to survive. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she had to hide it. She didn't need to shield herself from the world's judgment. The scar was part of her story, and it was one worth telling. The next day, Sarah returned to the cafe. The world outside hadn't changed. The whispers, the comments, the judgments, they were all still there. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She walked into the cafe with her head held high, no longer trying to hide her scar, no longer afraid of what others might think. And when Ethan walked in, as he always did, he looked at her with that steady gaze. But today there was no pity in his eyes, only admiration. "Good to see you," he said, his voice calm, and she could feel the depth of his words. He wasn't just acknowledging her presence, he was acknowledging her strength. And for the first time, Sarah allowed herself to smile, not just at him, but at herself. Ethan continued to come to the cafe, their bond growing deeper with each passing week. But this time, Sarah didn't just hide behind the counter. She wasn't the waitress with the scar. She was Sarah, the woman who had survived, who had fought through the pain, and who had learned to embrace herself, scar and all. In the months that followed, Sarah found herself standing in front of an art gallery where her paintings were displayed for the first time. It wasn't a grand exhibition, just a small show in a local space, but it was hers, and it was enough. Ethan stood beside her, not as a savior, but as someone who had always believed in her, who had always seen her for who she truly was. They didn't need to speak. The silence between them was enough. The door to the gallery opened, and a young girl walked in, her hoodie pulled low over her face, her hands stuffed deep into her pockets. She hesitated, looking around before her gaze landed on Sarah. Slowly, she walked up to her, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I saw your art," the girl said quietly. "I don't know if you'd ever hire someone like me, but I want to be part of something real." Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with a newfound understanding. "We don't hire perfect," she said softly. "We hire real, and real is always beautiful." And in that moment, Sarah realized that healing wasn't just about moving past that past. It was about choosing to live in the present, embracing the scars and finding beauty in the things that made her whole. As the gallery filled with the quiet hum of conversation, Sarah took a deep breath. This was her life now, scarred and beautiful, imperfect and whole. And for the first time, she was proud of it. In a world that often values perfection over authenticity, this story serves as a powerful reminder that our scars, both seen and unseen, are not marks of weakness but symbols of our strength. Sarah's journey from self-doubt to self-acceptance reveals the transformative power of vulnerability and the courage it takes to let others see us for who we truly are. The cruelty of judgment and the pain of societal expectations might seem unbearable at times. But the story teaches us that embracing our imperfections can lead to healing, connection, and profound personal growth. It reminds us that true beauty lies not in flawlessness, but in resilience, in choosing to rise after every fall, and in allowing ourselves to be loved despite or perhaps because of our scars. Sarah's journey shows that we all have the power to redefine ourselves, not by how others see us, but by how we see ourselves. We are all worthy of love, respect, and happiness, no matter the marks we carry. If this story resonated with you and inspired you to embrace your own strength, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to continue creating meaningful, empowering content that speaks to the heart. Stay tuned for more stories that touch lives and inspire change.